I'm Virginia Walsh. I come from Omaha. I've lived in Nebraska all my life. I first became interested in the women's movement because I was reading in women's studies, and that made a huge difference in my thinking. I hesitate to say where I was at the time. I was very conventional, very conservative, and what I realized as I read people like Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, was that there was a different way of living and thinking about yourself. I had been raised by parents who were very liberal, but they didn't have any effect on me because I was so busy doing my own thing. But when I read it from another source, I saw my life in different terms. So I was then about 50. I went back to school. I got a master's degree and began teaching women's studies in the course of time. And I always knew that was who I am. I could recognize myself in the stories of other women, and it was wonderful. Because before that time, I had a feeling that men had important lives and women did not. And after that, I did not see things that way.
Great. And what were the things that you were most involved with in the 70s, 80s?
There were a great many of them, and they went through various stages. But one of them I'm particularly interested in because it fits only Nebraska. We were interested, see, this was the time, the mid-70s were the time of civil rights legislation at the national level. And that was extremely interesting to me. And I became interested in making some kind of a change structurally in Nebraska's laws that would help women. That was a really immense goal and totally impractical at the time, but because I was just, fixing dinner for 7 children and things like that. But eventually, I realized that because Nebraska was unique in being a unicameral state, it had only one house, and that one a small one. So it only had 49 senators, whereas other states that were trying to pass civil rights legislation impacting women, for instance, would have 200. And ours was a kind of measurable goal. So I began thinking in terms of how to change the laws in Nebraska to make them better for women. Well, what I was already interested in was educational opportunity, post-secondary educational opportunity. And another woman, Rose Miley, and I had been working on that for 2 or 3 years already. So we had the groundwork laid. And what we realized is that if we would organize the women activists in the 14 Nebraska towns that we had already been working in, looking for women who were interested in post-secondary education, we could adopt, each one of us adopt a senator, and we could tell him our side of the story from his base community, because these would be the residents that live where he was elected. And that's what we did. So it was a series, really, of workshops that we would give on Adopt a Senator, where we would bring a group of women, say 30 women, into Lincoln and have a day-long activity in which they would meet their senator. They would talk about issues. They would get acquainted with one another, and they would learn the basics of lobbying. So that's pretty much what we did. And then we took that on the road and went to the 14 small cities in Nebraska which have some kind of college, either a community tech college or a state college or the like. And it was very effective. It involved a couple of different stages. It involved the process of choosing democratically what kind of legislation we wanted to propose each legislative session, and then determining how we were going to train ourselves to do that. And it was worth doing, and it worked.
Great. What were some of the legislative results?
The biggest one was the Nebraska Educational Equity Act, which was passed in about 1979, and which produced a lot of anecdotal amusement, because we would find out things like which senators had daughters who were in high school who had basketball talent, for instance, or which daughters in high school would have some other kind of perhaps counseling need. And it was wonderful to see how interested a senator could become once his own child was involved. That's not to say that we didn't encounter a lot of bias, and we encountered ridiculous kinds of prejudices about women can't play basketball. Well, just look at Iowa. Iowa has a big women's basketball program, and they only play half court. That used to bother my husband especially. He said, just let Iowa start running up the whole court. It was a study in how close the relationships are within a family to political events, such as who gets basketball programs in your local college. So it was a world of interest. We worked on credit, and that was quite easy. There wasn't much resistance to that. Equal credit for women. We worked on child care issues, and that was a real hurdle for women, especially in rural communities in Nebraska, where at the time the women were all stay-at-home moms, so that for them to be able to re-enter post-secondary education without childcare, it was a real measurable problem. And that's where the question of the allocation of resources became really important. It's not cheap to establish a child care center, but it was really important. So that was very gratifying to me because of the close nexus between the issue and my own emotional constitution. It made a lot of difference to me. So we did the adopt a senator thing for 3 years, and then with the growing resistance to civil rights laws generally in the country in the 1980s, that became more difficult to do. But we had a lovely lark initially.
Great. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the major?
I think the biggest events that I relished the most were the trips we made both to Washington, D.C. from Nebraska and to Chicago in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, because we chartered a bus each time and filled it and spent at least 2 days and endless hours on those buses, riding back and forth. But because when you are in a small, confined space like a bus, there's such wonderful interaction. So I can remember, for instance, when we were on our way to Chicago we had little sewing kits. We were making sashes that said Nebraska, and the letters in Nebraska spelled out ERA somehow, and so we were sewing these felt letters on a purple backdrop. It was historically authentic, a la the suffragettes in the second decade of the 19th century, 20th century. So we had lots of fun loaning the thimble back and forth and pushing the needles through. We had a really grand spirit, all kinds of people, all kinds of women. There were 3 generations from my family, especially in Chicago, but also in Washington, come to think on it. My mother was marching with us, and she was in her 70s, as I recall. My sister's children came, 2 of them, they were grade school age, and so that made the 3 generations. And we had a very large, a 20-foot banner that went across the street in Chicago that was held on 2 poles, and the trick was to keep the 2 poles together so they didn't separate and cause a calamity. But that banner said 3 generations, and in the word generation, the letters E-R and A appear, so they were enlarged, and then our family members marched in back of that banner, and we enjoyed ourselves immensely. I remember that there was a woman named Betsy Milliken who came from Nickerson, Nebraska, when we had just gotten up the morning of the march, because we slept over and rested. We got up and ate breakfast in the hotel, and then we came down, and when we had finished breakfast, Betsy said, "Forward, Mill," and we shouted and screamed and carried on and marched forward. And it was a graphic demonstration of the things that I believed in so strongly. Very gratifying. It's wonderful to be doing work that you really believe in.
Great. What are the things that you think are the most important that you women in general accomplished during that time?
Well, it was a moment of opportunity. It was about a 3-year period, mostly during the administration of Jimmy Carter, when there was a welcoming climate at the national leadership, and we knew that probably could not be sustained forever. But still, we hoped that it would, and we wanted very much to make the best use of our time. And there were questions about the structure of women's organizations that made us think a lot. There were many, many women's organizations in Nebraska, and many of them quite venerable and active in their own way. But they could not, it seemed to some of us, that they were not in a good position to respond to an opportunity very swiftly. And so we invented what was then called the Nebraska Coalition for Women, which was a coalition of organizations like the League of Women Voters and Business and Professional Women and quite a few other PEOs, as a matter of fact, a lot of other organizations, and we asked them if they would give us their activists, that they probably have some high energy people who might be willing, if the proper opportunity appeared, to work on women's issues. I mean, would you loan us, you're good workers, for a little while in this, you know, when we were talking about adopt a senator, we were talking about maybe a 4-month period during which the legislature was in session. And we didn't need a lot of lead time, but we needed the people who would put in the energy. And surprisingly, many women's organizations agreed to do that. They knew who their people were that were hot on these women's issues, and it was a good fit. We were very lucky about that. So what we had was a very loose organization structurally. It did not have extensive bylaws. It did not have a lot of security measures of different kinds that would protect its election process or that kind of thing. What it had was action and right now, and we found enough of those people. It wasn't a huge number. We didn't need a huge number. We only needed really about 10 people in each legislative district, and even that was a little generous. So, because when you are talking to senators where they live, there's a different dynamic that sets up. And we had a great deal of joy. We would meet every week of the legislative session, and we would compare our notes. Not all 30 of us, don't misunderstand me, but there was a cadre of people from Omaha and Lincoln that was maybe 10 out of the 30. And they would meet every week, and we would assess where we are and make the phone calls necessary to try to inject more energy into the conversation with some particular senator. There was only one woman in the unicameral during those years, and that was Shirley Marsh, who represented one of the Lincoln districts. She was a great help to us.
Do you feel, what are the things about, like, where do you see the differences in how women in their situation as far as their families and their jobs and that, the biggest advancements for women? I mean, we've talked a little bit about education, but what other things do you think that you saw that were different for women?
Well, the whole job market for women has changed radically. Jobs for women were not very plentiful when we started, and I didn't know whether women as a group would want to have jobs outside. The economy changed a great deal, but the opening up of the workforce was probably the most cosmic factor, one that we couldn't really control at all. But there were other changes that were starting to take place that were in the context of the quality of the relationship between a man and a woman in a family. My mother liked to say that there are democratic families, and then there are families that are anti-democratic, and those are very oppressive. And I always salute her memory because I think it's very true. But we were trying the best ways we could find to teach how transactions between couples could be handled with fair fighting and productive results. That was unmeasured. It was unmeasured. The only thing I know is that my husband and I worked on this for the rest of our lives.
Do you feel that young women today have a sense of where we are and where we need to go? What do you think are the most important things that could be done today? I mean, what are things that you see today that are happening that concern you?
Well, I think the most I don't know how to answer that. That is a really huge question. But I know that there is not a clear, adequate grasp of the historical progression that women have made. And maybe there doesn't have to be a great deal, but I think they need to know where the pitfalls are so that they don't fall into those same pits themselves. The control of reproduction is always immense. That is an immense factor. And of course, the whole national furor that arose during the 80s over the issue of abortion is an indication of the extent to which some conservative women had been, I think, persuaded to ally themselves with unborn children rather than with their own group, and I think that's a great pity. That's a really great pity, because as I say, reproduction is a major responsibility.
And do you see that situation today in a different light, or do you think that we're still fighting that same fight? What do you see in the way things are?
Well, part of the fight, Kathy, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, has gone the direction of giving permission and acceptance to women who are single mothers. And I think that is a tough road. I would like to see some more work done on that. I think that would help to ease the stress on the women involved. Mm-hmm. That's a very tricky issue, complicated. I think the role of organized religion is very interesting, because I think there's been a great deal of work done in some of the progressive organizations to be of more service to women and to, if possible, to redeem centuries of exclusion and of keeping them in their place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I salute those.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like in Nebraska we could bring about the kinds of changes in attitudes and beliefs in our unicameral now that were possible in the late 70s? Do you see that same sort of political atmosphere?
I know that the level of partisan resistance between the two dominant parties is much higher now than it was at the time. So I'm hesitant, but I have to say that in the last 2 or 3 years, I think that our unicameral has shown remarkable independence. And that gives me a lot of hope. So yes, I think we could still do it.
We need to adopt a senator program.
Adopt a senator program, you bet.
That's great. So what advice would you give to young women?
I would just hope that their awareness of women would be higher than mine was when I was young. I had the feeling that I somehow managed to color women gone for a lot of my youth. And I am sorry about that, and I'm trying to make that up. But if they can be in touch with their own group so that they understand what's happening, that would be the biggest start that I could think of.
And don't you think that with all the social media and things that are going on, you still see that they're not as much in touch with their peers?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that. I have insufficient data. They may be in touch with some things. I think there may be a little more interest in glamour than than I would think is necessary, but who am I to say?
So what do you think is the most important thing for young women to do today to advance women's issues?
Form good relationships with women and with men. Plan a good career, one that you can live with and love and grow with. Take a lot of caution about reproduction. That'll cover enough for right now.